what our best science is telling us is, look, this is a virtual reality. It's not the truth. And we have a headset on. That basically everything I've said, you can sort of get it from that. We're wearing a headset, full stop. That's what we're doing. We're wearing a headset. We're not saying the truth. And even when we introspect, we're introspecting through a headset, as long as we're thinking about things. The only way, from this point of view, that we might be in touch with something deeper is when we let go of thought altogether and just be with what we are. It's not a conceptual understanding of ourselves, but it's an understanding by being ourselves. And that may be what the spiritual traditions have been saying for a long time, but now we can do this with mathematics.
Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This is a conversation with Donald Hoffman. He is a professor emeritus of cognitive sciences at the University of California, Irvine. He is an author of 3 books, including The Case Against Reality, Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. In this conversation, we talk about splitting the consciousness, evolution and reality, modern theories of consciousness, conscious realism, and interface theory of perception. Enjoy the conversation, share, and subscribe to support the podcast. Thank you for listening. Hi, Donald. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jitendra. It's great to be here. Thanks for the kind invitation.
Yeah, so I was going through your career basically, and I see that you started your work on perception with the great Professor Marr, and also your chats with Francis Crick. That they are phenomenal. So, how do you summarize those kind of interactions and their role in your career?
Well, it was David Marr's work that got me into vision science. I was an undergraduate at UCLA taking a grad course on artificial intelligence. The professor was kind enough to let me in as an undergrad. And as part of the readings for that class, we read 1 or 2 of David Marr's papers. And when I read his papers, it was electrifying to me. It was like, wow, this guy is not just talking about vision. He's saying, build vision systems. If you don't know how to build them, you don't know what you're talking about. And that really spoke to me. It was like, wow. So I've been learning all this neuroscience, and we have all these hand wavy theories about how vision works. But David was saying, get in there, get in the trenches, build it. If you think you know how it works, build one that works. We have the computers now, we have sensors, go do it. And so I said, where is this guy? I want to work with him, because I was, it was my senior year at UCLA, so I was thinking about graduate school, and found out he was in the psychology department at MIT. And I thought, psychology at MIT? I didn't even know they had psychology. I think physics and mechanical engineering and so forth. So long story short, a year later, I spent a year working at Hughes Aircraft. It was the middle of the Cold War. I was writing software for a military microprocessor that was doing all sorts of stuff for the U.S. fighter jets and so forth. So I took a year to do that, and then I got lucky, got accepted, and went and worked with David Marr and Whitman Richards. They were my co-advisors. Whitman was a brilliant psychophysicist. Marr was a brilliant neuroscientist and AI. So I really had a good pair, and it was electrifying. Marr had assembled around him this incredible group of brilliant researchers, professors, graduate students. I knew immediately that I was lucky, but I had no idea how lucky I was. In retrospect, I was unbelievably lucky to be there at that time. And Marr was only my advisor for less than 2 years, maybe I forgot, 15, 16 months or something like that. He had leukemia and died, but I got to know him and got to work with him and got to see how he thought, and it was transformative. And Francis Crick actually entered the scene even then. He was a good friend with David Marr, and he was doing what he could to find the medical resources available at the time in 1981, 1982, to try to save David from death from leukemia. And so they were using all the most advanced techniques that they could, and Francis was trying to help him. So I that connection then, when I came out to, I got my PhD in '83, Francis had come out to the Salk Institute in Southern California, which is only an hour drive from Irvine. And so when I came out here, he knew I was David's student. He was good friends with David, so he invited me out. And I got to visit Francis at the Salk Institute and spend a day with him and talk about ideas. And they were starting up this Helmholtz Club group. And it, again, lucky me, it was being done at UC Irvine, because UC Irvine turns out to be in the middle of Southern California. So, you know, San Diego, UC San Diego and the Salk Institute are south. That's where Crick was, and Terry Sanowski and V.S. Ramachandran, the Churchlands and so forth. And then there were people from USC, which is north of Irvine, and so forth. So that ended up being a chance then to see them on a monthly basis. I got to see Crick for many, many years on a monthly basis at the Helmholtz Club in Irvine. And I could just walk from my home, just literally walk to the meetings and then walk home. So I mean, I just count myself very lucky.
So we were talking about Francis Crick, and so I mean, of course, Francis Crick is one of those scientists of 20th century who basically revived the research on consciousness, and his basic work focused around visual perception, right?
That's right. So of course, Francis is quite famous for his work with Watson on DNA double helix, and Francis had basically demystified life, right? Before his work with Watson, you could be a vitalist and say that there was something special about life. And what Crick figured he'd done is demystified it and showed that no, you can take a reductionist view to life and it's just a molecule. Once you understand that molecule, replication and genes and inheritance become sort of obvious. And so he then wanted to do the same thing for consciousness. Basically, life had been a mystery that was resolved largely. We now know there's a lot more to it, but a major impediment to understanding life had been resolved by a reductionist approach with the double helix of DNA. And so he thought that he could do the same thing, find the key elements of neuroscience. What are the neural structures or the neural patterns of firing, or the oscillation patterns? For a while, he thought there were 40 hertz oscillations that were critical to consciousness. And so what we were doing at the Helmholtz Club, what Crick spent a couple decades doing, was on the hunt for that key neuroscience discovery that would crack open the door, just like the double helix cracked open the door to understand life. And so we would have, every month, we have a couple invited speakers from anywhere in the world. They had a budget, they could bring in anybody they wanted to and house them. So we'd have two speakers. We'd have lunch at the University Club at like 1 o'clock or noon or to 1. And then we spend the entire afternoon with the speakers. And it was friendly, but intense, right? Francis was on a mission. That we weren't there to just chit chat. He wanted them to give us the goods. What have you found? What does it mean? And then we would really dive into it and ask what it meant, ultimately for consciousness. Of course, sometimes we had to focus on other things because it may not be directly about consciousness. We would then have to, understand the neuroscience phenomenon on its own terms, and then, step back and ask, was there any clue here that could be useful for the problem of consciousness? Then we would go to dinner and go into the evening, talking over dinner at some restaurant nearby. So that was incredibly fun. And so Francis really did, with his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, in 1993 or something like that, 1992, maybe it was 1994, I forget when. He really made it respectable to start to take the problem of consciousness seriously. When I was a grad student at MIT in the early 80s, it wasn't really something that a graduate student could do and be in good standing. That was too wishy-washy, too squishy. So Francis did a great job for the field by saying, look, this is a real important problem. We can't ignore it anymore. We can't say that we understand it. We need to get down and do some science here. So yeah, hats off to Francis for doing that.
That's why I wanted to basically cover this part, because it's really interesting to also kind of understand that how the scientist, or one of those scientists who decoded the code of life,
Right.
was actually going at it, like really wanted to have the or to know the code of consciousness, right? um
Absolutely. He was on a mission, and it was he was really focused in those Helmholtz Club meetings. He was always a gentleman. He was always very cordial, very friendly. But boy, his mind was really he penetrating insights. Even in his late 70s and early 80s, he was just really focused and really brilliant. He was made of something I'm not. It was just truly intelligent and incredible memory too. He could just he had a command of so many facts. So it was all in his head, and he was really trying to piece that puzzle together. Impressive.
yeah, that's so inspiring, because I mean, generally we do work with those difficult problems, no matter on which scale you are working. So just that you want to go for it. And when you hear these kind of cases and these kind of stories, they are really inspiring.
That's
Okay.
right.
And
And his
the
focus was for decades, right? It was for decades. He didn't, I didn't get it in 1 year, I'm giving up. No. He was in for the long haul. So
Yeah, and in the case against reality, for me, the first shocker, because it is a series of shockers basically throughout the
yeah.
book. The first shocker was the split brain experiments. I
Yes.
mean, yeah, like in my case, I didn't know those examples, and once I read it, and I was like, oh, this can happen, So this was like already a big shock.
Yes, it turns out that with certain people that have extreme epilepsy, that drugs fail to cure or at least tap it down so you can live a good life. They tried a very desperate surgery where they would literally cut the brain in half. There's two hemispheres, a left and right hemisphere. They're coupled together, joined together by essentially electric cable of axons, neural axons, called the corpus callosum. There's 220 million of these roughly. And the idea of the surgery, and one of the guys who did the surgery ended up being a member of the Helmholtz Club, so Joe Bogan. So I got to know Joe and become friends with Joe over dinner and at lunch and so forth at the Helmholtz Club for many years. He was another brilliant, wonderful man that was, just my good luck to get to know these incredible pioneers. So what Joe did, and there were some other surgeons, they the goal was to try to confine the epileptic seizure to one hemisphere. Epilepsy is caused by a bad part of the brain called a focus that's sending out incorrect signals that can get the whole brain system into the wrong chaotic kind of neural firing. So the hope was that if the problem was, say, on the right hemisphere, cutting the corpus callosum would prevent the electrical signals to get to the left hemisphere. And it turned out it worked. It was a clinical success. Once they had recovered from the surgery, in many cases, the family said that there was not much anything that they could tell different about the person. The brain was cut in half, but they seemed otherwise quite normal. But when this was looked at more closely, they discovered that there was something very different about these people. You can literally have a left hemisphere, and there was a lot of work. Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga and others were involved in this. Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for this work, and Michael Gazzaniga carried on and did a lot more studies subsequently. And then many others, including my friend V.S. Ramachandran, who was part of the Helmholtz Club, also studied these patients. And what comes out is that the two hemispheres can have different personalities. The left hemisphere can have a very different personality from the right hemisphere. They can have different contents in their minds. So the left hemisphere can be aware of the word ring, And the right hemisphere can be aware of the word key, and there's nobody that's aware of the phrase key ring if you flash that in front of people. In one case, Rama, V.S. Ramakandran and his friends call him Rama. So when I say Rama, it's Professor V.S. Ramakandran at UC San Diego, but Rama. Rama found one patient whose left hemisphere, I think, was believed in God, and the right hemisphere was an atheist. So not only can they apparently have different contents of consciousness, key versus ring, for example, or have awareness of one kind of object versus another, they can even have different personalities and different political and religious beliefs. So in some sense, the split brain patients show not only perhaps a division of consciousness, but a division of the person itself and even of religious beliefs. Truly stunning. And this may explain some of the internal dialogues and conflicts that we each have. Friday night, what do I want to do? Do I want to study? Do I want to party? And maybe there's my left hemisphere wants to party and my right hemisphere wants to study, or vice versa. Probably it would be the right hemisphere that wants to party and the left hemisphere that wants to study. But
yeah, and this splitting of consciousness, basically, it's so this shows that somehow that our reality is kind of different, like the way we perceive it, right? So first of all, because there's this view that in general, the view of vitalism, that the fact that everything is there in the neurons, right? Because if that's the case, then we shouldn't be able to kind of split that consciousness, right?
Right. It does. It is intriguing in terms of understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. It appears that with the intact brain, there may be a unified person. With the corpus callosum split, when it's completely split. Now, Joe Bogan sometimes didn't split it all the way, because you only want to cut as much as you needed to. But in cases where it was pretty much completely severed, then you had evidence that suggested that, at least for certain kinds of like visual experiences, the content was entirely different. So there was not one unified consciousness. When one hemisphere has seen the word key and the other hemisphere has the conscious experience of seeing the word ring, and no one has seen both. I know that there are people who've tried to argue for a unified consciousness, even despite the split brain stuff, but it's not compelling to me at all. So this is the kind of evidence that Francis and Helmholtz Club and others have been looking at, is to look at these neural correlates of consciousness, whether it be the entire left and right hemisphere correlates of personality and religious beliefs and so forth, or even more fine, like area V4 of visual cortex and its correlation with color perception, and area MT and its correlation with motion perception and so forth, or the fusiform face area and its correlation with our perception of the identity of faces. So we have dozens and dozens of these neural correlates of consciousness. So actually, there's been a lot of work, brilliant work by my colleagues in the neurosciences and also AI and computer science. They've been thinking about this as well. So we have all these neural correlates of consciousness. And of course, that's not a theory. Those are the data to be explained. So we have all these correlations. The question is, okay, how do we explain why we find this correlation between area V4 activation and the experience of color? And what we want is not a hand wave. I would like to know exactly, if you claim that the activity in area V4 somehow causes color experience, then I want to know exactly what activity must cause green 53 and why it could not be green 54, and why it couldn't also be the taste of chocolate. Why is it that neural activity couldn't be the taste? So in other words, as a scientist, I'm very, very hard-nosed. No one has to take on this problem. It's not a scientific theory, that a problem that any scientist has to take on. But if they take it on, and if they claim that neural activity causes color experience in V4, then I say, okay, well, that's what you've chosen to do. It's our job as scientists to ask tough questions. Exactly what kind of activity in V4 must be green 54? And why is it that it could not be green 53? If you can't do that, let me know when you got something of interest. So the neural correlates are, of course, really important empirical bits of data that we need to find. But as scientists, we understand that the data is not the theory. That's the data is the thing to be explained. And so right now, the state of play is there are many brilliant people working on this. Many of them are my friends. Hats off to them. They're doing hard work. But there's not a single specific conscious experience that can be explained in terms of either integrated information or global workspace, or there's lots of different approaches that have been taken here. So there's just simply not one conscious experience that can be explained. So that's where we are. We're batting zero. We don't have a single specific conscious experience that we can say this experience is completely explained by this pattern of activity, whether it's single neuron or microtubule, quantum collapse of microtubules, orchestrated collapse of microtubules, or some kind of network model, whatever the model you want. There's not one brain-based or even AI more generally, physically based system that can explain without handwave any one specific conscious experience. And that's what I would like. I'd love to have the first specific conscious experience explained by some theory, and we're batting zero right now.
Wow. I think that should motivate some of the scientists, I hope, not demotivating.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So what does evolution has to do with this? Because that's where I think the betting is going on, right? Like, so we take de facto that through evolution we get all the complexity on Earth, right? And now, like, after all the billions of years, at least there is one species who's trying to ask those questions, right? And now this species is stuck with this problem. So what is happening here? Is there is there any compatibility issue itself?
Right. So that's the right kind of question to ask, because as scientists, what we have to do is to take our best current theories, for example, evolution by natural selection, or quantum field theory in the case of physics, and we have to push them to the limits and see what they tell us. And something very interesting has come out of this in both cases, in quantum field theory and evolution by natural selection. And it has to do with two key assumptions that have been spectacularly successful in science. One assumption is the ontology of space-time. The idea that space-time, or under Newton, space and time, but then since Einstein, space-time. Space-time is fundamental, plus the objects inside space-time, the particles and the bigger groups of particles that we call objects, like neurons and brains. These objects in space-time are part of the fundamental ontology that science has had, a physicalist ontology. And then along with that ontology has been a very successful methodology of reductionism. The idea of reductionism, quite simply, is as you go to smaller and smaller scales in space or space-time, you will find the more and more fundamental laws of nature. So and that has been why we build the Large Hadron Collider and spend billions and billions of dollars smashing protons into each other, so we can see at high energies, what physics tells us at high energies, you're going to smaller and smaller scales. And which is a little counterintuitive perhaps, but that's the way the world works. With higher energies, you go to smaller and smaller scales. Basically, as you look at smaller and smaller parts of nature, you need light with finer and finer wavelengths. It has to be smaller wavelengths. And it turns out with smaller wavelengths of light have higher energy. So that's why you need higher energy. So effectively, E equals h nu is the equation. So we have to look at evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory and ask what they tell us about this problem of consciousness, right? And here's the surprise. In both cases, they tell us something that we didn't expect, that space-time cannot be fundamental. It's just not fundamental. And this follows both from evolution by natural selection and from physics. So the physicists can tell you exactly where it stops. It stops at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. It's not that there are pixels of space-time there, it's that it ceases to be coherent. The very notion of space-time ceases to be coherent. 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. And it's actually not that deep. If it was 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 trillion seconds, I'd be impressed. That's a really, space-time has been a really, really good, but it's only 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. So this is not terribly deep, and it falls apart. So, and with it then goes reductionism. It turns out you can't go beyond 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. You can't get any, so reductionism just stops, it halts. And in fact, if you try to go smaller by adding more and more energy, making finer and finer wavelengths of light, what happens is you get bigger and bigger black holes. So you actually go to larger and larger scales. So reductionism is dead. Space-time is doomed, reductionism is dead. And this also follows from evolution by natural selection. And I'll just sketch it briefly. But what's impressive is that the two pillars of modern science agree. Space-time is doomed, reductionism is dead. With the argument from evolution by natural selection takes a different tack. What I and my team of researchers have been looking at, and this, I should mention that this started off with some graduate students, Justin Mark and Brian Marion, who did brilliant creative work for their PhDs on this, like in 2010 to 2012. And then more recently, Chetan Prakash, Manish Singh, and Chris Fields and others have worked with me on this. In particular, Chetan, his mathematics has been really critical because my graduate students working with me did some good simulations that made me convinced that evolution was telling us something very important here. But simulations aren't theorems. And so I went to my good friend Chetan Prakash and Manish Singh and my team, and we worked on this together. But Chetan was the genius mathematician who has brought it home. We all worked on it and helped him, but without Chetan it wouldn't have happened. And the basic idea is we use evolutionary game theory, which was John Maynard Smith in the 1970s took Darwin's basic idea, his brilliant ideas, and then their own evolution. I mean, his ideas evolved within the modern synthesis and so forth. But Maynard Smith basically then mathematized it using the tools of game theory. And it allowed us to think about evolution algorithmically with precision. Darwin had made assumptions, of course, about animals in space and time, fighting over physical resources and so forth. It was a very physical kind of thing. And so you might, if you thought, well, can I ask using evolution by natural selection whether physicalism is true? You might say, well, I mean, the theory assumes physicalism to begin with. How could you possibly use the theory to ask whether physicalism is true? And that's the glory of science. With the mathematization that John Maynard Smith did, you get the algorithmic core and separated from all the peripheral assumptions that sort of led Darwin into the theory. You can ask now that we've got the core of evolution, what does it entail? And the question that I asked with my graduate students and then later on with my collaborator Chetan and others is, what is the probability that natural selection would shape sensory systems of organisms to show true facts about objective reality, right? So it's a clean, technical question. This is not prior to John Maynard Smith's work, mathematizing evolution by natural selection, that question would be something to have a drink Friday night with the buddies and chat about because you're not going to get anywhere. With the mathematics, now it's a matter of theorem and proof. This is a clean technical question. What is the probability that any sensory system of any organism has ever been shaped by natural selection to show any true fact about objective reality, any true structure. And what one can show is the evolution by natural selection entails the probability is precisely zero. This is using the tools of evolutionary game theory, or evolutionary graph theory. And we substantiated this also with genetic algorithms that actually simulated evolutionary processes, and we found the same thing. What we found was that simulated organisms that didn't see reality, but were just tuned to fitness payoffs, and I'll mention what fitness payoffs are, systematically outcompeted organisms that saw the truth, but that were of equal complexity. They would just drive them to extinction. There were very special cases when that didn't happen, but the probability was zero. So I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying the probability is zero. So if you're going to bet, you'd bet the farm that no one sees the truth, right? So the key notion that I mentioned was fitness payoffs. And for those who know evolutionary biology, that's basics. It's just the ABCs of the field. But I'll just mention it briefly because some people may not know the theory. Think about a game. If you're playing a video game, and you're competing with other players or just against the game, you need to get as many points as you can, as quickly as you can, to get to the next level of the game or to beat your opponent. And if you do anything besides gather those points, you're going to lose the game. You're going to die, or your opponents are going to beat you. And that's intuitively what evolution is about. It's the fitness payoffs are like the points in the game, and the more fitness payoff points you get, that translates into the higher probability that you'll have kids, have offspring. So it's really about, it's not about seeing the truth, it's about having kids. And the question is, does seeing the truth help you have kids? Well, when we analyze these fitness payoffs, you can ask a technical question. Since the fitness payoffs are the only thing that's keeping you alive, they're the only thing that's shaping, the payoffs are what's shaping the bodies and the senses of the organisms, right? That is the fitness payoffs. So, and these fitness payoffs are functions. They're functions that depend on whatever the world might be. So we don't have to assume we know what the world is. We can say, maybe the world is some structure that has, say, a total order. 1 is less than 2 is less than 3 is less than 4. So there's some total order structure, or there's a topology, or there's a metric, or there's lots of different structures the world might have. And then you can ask, what is the probability that a fitness payoff function will actually contain information about that structure, say the total order, right? So evolutionary theory gives us no reason to say that certain fitness payoff functions are more likely than others, with one exception that I can talk about if you're interested. But it's a technical point. But any fitness payoff is fair game. So we have to look at the set of all fitness payoffs, and then we can ask how many of those fitness payoffs preserve, say, a topology, or preserve a total order, or some other kind of structure. And what you can show, and what Chetan showed, is in case after case, as you can write down a formula that says what fraction of the payoff functions preserve that structure. And then as you let the number of payoff values get larger and the number of states in the world get larger, in the limit you find in each case, the probability goes to zero. In other words, of all the fitness payoffs that are out there, the probability that the fitness payoff you got that's shaping you right now, that has information about the structure of the world is precisely zero. And since the payoff that's shaping your senses doesn't contain information about the structure of the world, then how in the world are your senses going to be shaped to that structure in the world? And if you're interested, we can go into, I've gotten pushback, some intelligent pushback from friends and colleagues. We can go into details where they say, well, if you have thousands and thousands of fitness payoffs and they're changing, you can try to get to truth. And so we can talk about that if you want. But if not, then the basic story is just this. The payoffs don't contain information about the structure of reality. So good luck tuning your senses to the structure of reality. So, space and time, physical objects. These are objects of our senses. These are what our sensory systems report to us. And what evolution is saying is the probability is zero that space and time and objects have any bearing or any relationship to the true structure of reality, whatever it might be. And surprisingly, and not surprisingly, that's what physics is telling us. Space-time is doomed. There's something far more fundamental than space-time, and physicists are looking. They're not throwing up their hands and going, "Oh, we can't do this." They're no. The young Turks are going, "Fabulous! There's something new for us to do. Let's jump in there." Einstein was great. Space-time was great. It's over. Let's go. This is fun. They're finding structures like cosmological polytope and amplituhedron. They're finding interesting structures beyond space-time. So this is all very, very good. It's not time to throw up our hands. It's time, a lot of scientists thought Newton was the final word in the 1880s and 1890s, and it was a real shock that wasn't the truth. Newton is still useful, but in terms of a conceptual framework for understanding reality at its deepest, no. You wouldn't want to go with Newton. You can use Newton to send a rocket to the moon, but I wouldn't use Newton to try to understand the deep underpinnings of reality. And now we thought, quantum theory and special relativity and general relativity were, the true insights into the nature of reality. Now we're realizing the physicists are telling us there's something far deeper than space-time and Hilbert spaces. In other words, by Hilbert spaces, I'm saying the very mathematical foundations of quantum theory. There's something far deeper than space-time and quantum theory. It's these polytopes that they're finding right now. And quantum theory and space-time seem to then somehow emerge, joined together from this deeper reality. So this is, I would say, for the next generation of young researchers, this is all very, very good news. Reductionism and the ontology of space-time have been extremely powerful tools, and it's time for the next generation to, say thank you for all that good work. And now it's our time to go beyond space-time and find the new structures and show how we don't throw away the old work of Newton and Einstein and quantum theory. We don't throw that away. In fact, it's exceedingly valuable. Any deeper theory that we come up with better project back into space-time, and it better give us the theories that we know and love in space-time. If it cannot do that, or show how it's even more general in space-time than quantum theory, so it better give us back what we know and love, or something deeper, but not less. It cannot give us something less. And if it can't do that, then your deeper theory is just not worth interest. It's not interesting. So it's got to project into space-time and give us back all Newton, Einstein, and quantum theory, or it's wrong. So this is actually, it's a shock to the system. I know the first time I took seriously the idea that I might not be seeing the truth, it was so shocking to me. I had to sit down. I literally had to sit down because it was just too upsetting. I just didn't know what to do. It was like something that I just knew was true all of a sudden had been pulled out from under me. And so I completely understand when people are aghast at what I'm saying and can't believe it. But eventually, it's you come to terms with it, and then you realize, well, this is an opportunity. It's a chance to, if I'm not seeing the truth, I might as well wake up to it. Hey, I might as well wake up to it and go beyond space and time, and presumably there'll be lots of stuff to discover and new technologies that will come back and be helpful. So.
Well, there is a lot of information there, so let's try to unpack and kind of summarize it. So what are we saying here is that through the course of evolution, by natural selection or any other process of evolution, we get the brains, let's say, and these are the brains that they are trying to study, or basically trying to study the universe, but they have this mechanism called perception, which gives us this consciousness kind of property, right? And what we are perceiving is another property, which is called space-time. And this space-time, when we go to physicists and they are telling us that no, the space-time is like an emergent property in the universe. So it's not like actual reality itself, right?
Right.
So the point here is then, and what we are trying to say is that basically we don't understand consciousness yet, because we are trying to find the answer in something or in a reality which does not really exist. So we need like parameters or maybe more or new kind of physics, new kind of in general new science probably, which is beyond space time, which will have like more or different kind of explanations for the universe, the existence of the universe, etc., and which can give us better explanation for the actual reality. But then what do we perceive?
Right. So that's a good summary, and our theories are good enough to tell us where they stop. So general relativity in quantum field theory tell us space-time is doomed at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Evolution by natural selection tells us that space-time and objects are just data structures. They're not the truth. They're just data structures that we've evolved. But that's the glory of science. The scientific theories tell you where they stop, where they can no longer help you. They don't tell you where to go next, right? They don't tell you what's beyond space-time. That is up to, and then that's fun. I mean, that's where the scientist gets to have fun, right? Well, that space-time is doomed. Well, what's beyond space-time? Well, our theories can't tell us. Okay, well, let's have a beer, maybe smoke something, talk with our friends. Let's get our ideas wherever we can and see if we can't make a leap beyond space-time. Of course, eventually we'll have to rein it in, make it mathematical, and show how space-time emerges. So the same thing with evolution. Well, so one implication of that, as you mentioned, is all of our attempts to understand consciousness using the assumption that objects in space-time are fundamental and that we should have a methodology of reductionism. It's no wonder that they have, I mean, I started off by saying my brilliant friends and colleagues who are doing this work haven't been able to explain a single specific conscious experience. No wonder. Objects in space-time are not fundamental. So if you try to make them fundamental and boot up consciousness from them, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So the sooner my friends and colleagues really grasp this and really come to terms with it, the quicker we can move beyond a framework that is guaranteed not to work. It's for me it's interesting. I mean, it's sad in the sense that my brilliant colleagues could really make progress on consciousness. They're just saddled with the wrong assumption. It's like someone trying to understand the photoelectric effect, but only being willing to use Newtonian physics to try to understand it. Well, you just can't use Newtonian physics to understand the photoelectric effect. It's not going to work. And it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you start with Newton, you cannot do it. And that's where my colleagues are. They're smart enough, more than smart enough, to really make advances in understanding consciousness. They just need to get rid of space-time and physical objects as fundamental and the methodology of reductionism for the problem of consciousness. Now, a couple of things I should say about this. One is, whatever this deeper theory is, it may not look like evolution by natural selection, right? And it may not look like objects. It's going to be something entirely different, quite possibly, just utterly different. So there may not be any notion of time. In fact, the structures that the physicists are finding beyond space-time, time is not part of it, nor is space, right? So we're going to have to really, it's going to hurt, right? This is going to really hurt. How do you think about a world without time, right? You might think that the human brain simply can't do that. Well, we can, because we have mathematics. So whatever that deeper reality is, it's going to have to show us where time comes from. And if it doesn't have time, in some sense, it might not have evolution. So you're going to have to show why things look like evolution from our perspective, when in fact there is no evolution at a deeper theory, at a deeper level. All right. So I'll just give you one, just real quick. There are ways to do this. So the cosmological polytope and amplitude heater and so forth are structures where there is no time, but you can show certain facets of the cosmological polytope can give rise to time and give rise to space. And in the model that I'm working on, so I'm working on a model in which consciousness is fundamental, but not the way it's typically thought of, where you're saying, okay, well, here's this physical system. How does it create consciousness? That game is over. So I'm not starting with some physical system and saying, what kind of integrated information properties does it need to have? What kind of microtubule states and coherent collapse does it need? What kind of global workspace structure does it need? Or not even a panpsychist approach. And I have many good friends and colleagues, people that I respect and have as friends who are panpsychists, but panpsychism says space and time are fundamental, but the particles like the protons and quarks and gluons and so forth, in addition to their physical properties, also have a unit of consciousness. So they're trying to bring consciousness in as fundamental somehow, but the problem is they're still trying to keep space-time and objects in space-time as fundamental, and our best science is saying you can't go there. That's not fundamental. If you're really trying to get a fundamental theory, you have to go something deeper and show where those particles in space-time come from. So I'll just say I'm working on what's called a Markovian dynamics of consciousness. And it turns out that Markovian dynamics does not need to have the kind of time that we have here, entropic time, where we have the second law of thermodynamics that says essentially that there's an arrow of entropy. Entropy is almost always increasing. It's never decreasing. And, so I'll call that entropic time. It turns out in these Markovian dynamical systems, there need not be entropic time. The entropy of the dynamical system need not increase. It can be constant. And so I'm working on that kind of model of consciousness in which there is no entropic time, but it's easy to prove. It's a 3-line proof that this Markovian dynamical system, even if it's so-called stationary, so that the entropy is not increasing with the sequence in the dynamics, any projection of it, so if you look at that, so the dynamics has no entropic time, consciousness has no entropic time, but if you don't look at the whole thing, if you just look at it from a projection, from a perspective, using what's called conditional probability, then you can prove that you will induce entropic time. It's an artifact of a perspective. You're not seeing the whole thing as it is, you're seeing it through a perspective, and that's when you get this entropic time. So it may be that there, at the level of consciousness, there may not be competition, there may not be survival of the fittest, there may not be all this stuff, but whatever's going on with consciousness, when you look at it from a particular projection, you induce this entropic time. And time is, if you think about it, perhaps our most valuable resource. It's our most limited resource. We're all going to die. We all have a finite amount of time. So time, all of a sudden we have this very limited resource and there was no limited resource in the fundamental reality. There was no entropic time. So all of a sudden we get this entropic time, we get this fundamental limited. So all of a sudden now we're in a world of limited resources and the whole thing now looks like a competition. So it could be that evolution by natural selection, the whole competitive thing is an artifact that you get from a perspective of something in which there's no competition. That would be a truly stunning result. And I'm pursuing that. I'm going to be very interested to see if I can show that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what you mentioned that the consciousness, or you're considering consciousness as fundamental, because that's important, especially when we rule out space and time, because and since we are evolved in, of course, those kind of conditions, and then we need to either take a stand, basically, that either it's fundamental or it is also emergent. But like, what or why do you like, if we can briefly just talk from the consciousness perspective, that why do we have to make it fundamental, right?
Right. Great question. So consciousness is just a word, right? It's up to us as scientists to fill in the details of what we mean. And my attitude about science here is that there is never going to be a theory of everything in science. for a principled reason. A scientific theory always says, if you grant me these assumptions, then I will explain all these other things. So the theory is a theory of everything except its assumptions. The assumptions are the miracles of the theory. If you say, well, now I'll give you a new theory that explains those assumptions, great. That new theory will have its own new assumptions. So this is job security for science. There is never going to be a theory of everything. There'll always be a theory of everything except my assumptions. And just like when the child says to the mom and dad, but why? And you say, and you give them, but why is that true? And all of a sudden, at some point, you realize, whoa, I mean, the kid is right. At some point, I just have to stop and say, it's just that way. Shut up. It's just that way. Well, that's where my explanation stops. And so when I say consciousness, the best I can do to begin with is to use words to point to what I mean, right? So if I'm, and if you weren't conscious, it wouldn't succeed. For example, if you're a blind person, good luck with me trying to tell you what I mean by the word red. If I have a child that's not blind and I point to an apple and I say, oh, that apple is red, I'm not really explaining what red is. I'm counting on them to know for themselves from their own experience what red is. And I'm literally just pointing to an experience that they have. And so the first thing I can do is just point to what I'm talking about. And then what we do as scientists is say, okay, now that you know firsthand from your own experience what I'm pointing to, now let's put some mathematics to it. And of course, my mathematics is not the territory. My mathematics is not the consciousness. But I'm saying if we use this mathematics to describe the consciousness, what kind of insights can we get from it? So the kind of pointers I will give you are this kind of thing. You know, what does it feel like when you hit your thumb with a hammer? Right? That's a conscious experience. What does it feel like when you're not thinking about anything and you're just awake and alert, but you're not thinking about anything and you're in a dark room? There's something it's like to be aware, even when you're not aware of anything in particular. So there's this awareness without content that we all seem to have firsthand acquaintance with. And there's awareness of content, like hitting your thumb with a hammer or seeing the color red or having a headache or tasting chocolate. So these are the kinds of things that I can point to, and consciousness is no more problematic in this regard than anything else that we learn. If I want to tell you what if I'm telling my child, 18-month-old child, what a rabbit is, right? So there's the child, I'm sitting with my child and there's a rabbit on the floor in front of us. And how am I going to talk about that physical object, the rabbit, and teach it to my child? I don't give it a lecture on, mammals and so forth. I point with my finger and I say rabbit. And when the child is the right age, if I do it at 2 months of age, it's not going to work. I can point and say rabbit, it will not happen. It will not get it. And it doesn't matter, it's not because I'm stupid, it's the child is not ready. But at a certain age, you point and say rabbit, and they just get it. And that's actually miraculous, because mathematically, there's an infinite number of things the child could guess you meant. Maybe you meant the fur texture of the rabbit. Maybe you meant the color. Maybe you meant the left paw and the rug that the rabbit is sitting on. Maybe you meant the third whisker on the left. Maybe you meant the color of the eye. There are countless things that you could mean, but the child and the mother both know that there is a rules of this game, the language game. The mother doesn't point and say quadruped. If the child said that, if the mother said that to the child, we would know that the mother is really messing up the child. You don't point for the first time to a rabbit and say quadruped. You point and you say rabbit, or you don't say mammal. So we have these rules by which this is called ostensive definition, right? You pointing and learning by essentially pointing. And so we learn even about physical objects by ostensive definition. And so when I use ostensive definition to point to what I mean by consciousness, I'm in no worse shape than physical objects. So there's nothing especially squishy about consciousness here. And in fact, I will argue, in fact, that what we called physical objects were nothing but contents of consciousness to begin with. The rabbit is, in fact, nothing but a content of consciousness. So what we took to be a physical reality really is just a content of consciousness. And we've been pointing to contents of consciousness all along, not knowing that that's what it was. So now we have to have a mathematical model. And I propose one, and for those who are interested, it's a paper with Chetan Prakash. So Donald Hoffman and Chetan Prakash is called Objects of Consciousness. So anybody who wants to can go read the math. And our theory is not the final theory. I take it as 1.0, consciousness 1.0. And I look forward, hopefully in my lifetime, to seeing other people tear my theory apart. And hopefully I can see 25.0 before I die and see where the theory has gone. But the way science works is you put some mathematics down, you put your assumptions down, you start to look at what it entails, and then you find the limits, and then you explore those limits, and then you get a new, deeper theory. And so that's what we're up to. But each step, you need to be able to get all the work that's been done before, right? So what I'm working on right now with my colleagues is trying to show how we can get the structures that the physicists are finding beyond space-time, like the amplitude-hedron and cosmological polytopes, from the long-term behavior, the asymptotic behavior of this dynamic Markovian dynamics of conscious agents. So that's what we're up to. It's going to take a while, but I probably won't get it done before lunch today.
Yeah, and so one thing that or let's basically make the case against reality, right? So why do we need to, like, of course that this is true that that this we can, and I was also listening to other physicists, and some of them, they agree that the space and time, they are emergent properties. So whatever is going on there, that's another that's probably another conversation. But at least, like, from biology point of view, when we are really going and making consciousness fundamental, and that we are looking for something like somewhere else for the explanation. But then what is happening with our kind of interface? I mean, it feels real, right? Like, it feels real that I'm talking to you. I don't know whether, or many examples that you also give in the book, whether sun is there or not, and all the conversations that you had with Francis Crick.
Right.
So what is then this? What is this? Can we call it perceived reality, or it's just an illusion?
Right. So great question. I'll try to answer it just within the framework of evolutionary theory itself, right? It's not from this deeper framework first. From an evolutionary perspective, what emerges is organisms are evolving sensory systems to keep them alive long enough to reproduce. That's the evolutionary story, right? That's what our sensory systems are there for. They're there to guide adaptive behavior, full stop. That's what they're there for. Most of us have assumed that the way to guide adaptive behavior is to show you the truth. Not all the truth, but I mean, if there really is a bear there, you should know that there is a bear there, and not walk into the bear, things like that. If there's a cliff, you should know that there really is a cliff, and you shouldn't walk off. So we assume that, of course, the right way to have adaptive behavior is to see the truth, at least the parts of the truth that you need to see. We don't need to see quarks and gluons. That's not really what we need to see, but we do need to see cliffs and tigers and bears, right? So we need to see those parts of reality that are critical for our survival. And so that's been the assumption. But what it turns out evolution is really doing is something different. It's not giving you a window on the truth. It doesn't evolve senses that are a window on reality, because the reality is too complicated. You don't need to know it. You just need to know how to behave to stay alive, to play the game. That's it. And so you don't have a need to know. And knowing the truth is irrelevant to staying alive. So people still will go, I don't understand. How could knowing the truth be irrelevant to staying alive? And in fact, I would claim an impediment to staying alive. It actually gets in the way. And I think a metaphor that's perhaps the most helpful that I've run across is your desktop interface on your computer, right? If you're writing an email and the icon for the email, or you're writing a book, right? You've spent the last 2 years writing a book. You poured your heart into this book, and the icon for the book is blue and rectangular in the middle of your screen. That doesn't mean that the book itself is blue and rectangular in the middle of your computer. I mean, if you thought that, you have no idea what's really going on with your computer. The whole point of your desktop interface is to completely hide the truth. The diodes and resistors, the voltages, magnetic fields, the megabytes of software. If you had to know all that stuff to write a book, there would be no books. Or if you had to know all that stuff to craft an email, you wouldn't be able to send emails. So the point of an interface is to hide the truth, to give you eye candy that guides your fingers so you know where to type and where to drag and so forth. It tells you what you need to know to act intelligently. You don't need to know the truth. In fact, that's too complicated. So you have a user interface. So what evolution gave us, all organisms with probability 1, so it's probability 0 that this didn't happen according to evolution, we all evolved user interfaces. That's what we evolved. So this 3D world is like a metaverse. It's a virtual reality headset that evolution gave us to interact with a reality that's utterly unlike space and time. As far as complicated and sophisticated and overwhelming as space and time and physical objects might seem to us, they're trivial, absolutely trivial compared to the reality behind. Nothing compared to the reality behind that. So, and that's part of the fun now, right? We thought this would we thought that this space-time universe, billions of light years across, trillions of stars, hundreds of billions of galaxies, we're entirely impressed. It's trivial compared to the reality beyond it. And that's why evolution by natural selection has given us this trivial interface, because the reality is far more complicated. So this is, again, great job security for science, right? There's plenty to explore. And this is beyond even the physicist notions of multiverse. This is something beyond the very notion of space and time completely.
And what do you think about the technology, right? That the fact that we can use a camera or a telescope to monitor, I don't know, the sun or the other planets which are going around. Can they capture the reality, like the true reality, or it's just, again, a kind of biased interface which we get it through the course of evolution? We kind of just transfer the same similar interface on these machines.
Well, that's a great question, and I think it's a good question to address, because I think a lot of people will have that question come up and go, "Gotcha! Cameras see the same thing I do, so therefore we both must be seeing the truth." And the answer is that any interface that's sophisticated enough will be able to do this. So in the metaverse, we'll be spending a lot of time in the metaverse. We will, of course, have tools where we can take pictures of what we see in the metaverse and share them with our friends. This is what I saw in the metaverse. So we'll have virtual cameras and virtual telescopes and so forth. And any interface that's sophisticated enough will allow you to do that. And it's simply because it's a good user interface. It doesn't mean we're seeing the truth. And so this question won't even arise when, to the next generation that are going inside the metaverse, spending a lot of time there and seeing all sorts of cool things and wanting to take pictures of what they saw or what they just made in the metaverse and tweeting it to their friends and so forth. Here's a cool shot of what, so they took a virtual camera and took a picture. The software coordinated the two. It was coordinated. It's not because the metaverse is the reality, is that there's a coordination that goes outside the metaverse that makes that possible. I also have a knee-jerk reaction that very, very smart people have to this whole approach of evolution by natural selection. They say, look, um, if our ancestors didn't see the truth, we wouldn't be here to be debating whether there was the truth. So, haha, got you on that. Those one-offs just don't come to grips with the complexity and the sophistication of evolutionary game theory. When you come to grips with the true mathematical structure of evolution by natural selection, just like when you come to grips with the true structure of quantum field theory and Einstein's theory of gravity, then you see the real limitations of those theories. You have to really come to grips. When Einstein wrote down the equation of general relativity in 1915, it was a year later or so that a guy named Schwarzschild, playing with those equations, discovered that they entail what we call black holes. Einstein didn't know that. Einstein didn't like that. But that black hole was the beginning of the end. That is the death, ultimately, of space-time. And so even an Einstein hadn't come to grips with the depths of his own theory, and he's a genius. So we can expect that we really have to, spend a lot of time looking at the mathematical structure of our theories to really see their limits and to see where our intuitions were wrong. If Einstein can be wrong in his intuitions about his own theory, we shouldn't be so quick to pass judgment that we think we know what evolution entails. No, you have to do your homework. Your one-off line that says, if our ancestor didn't see the truth, we wouldn't be here to talk about it, that's just not deep enough. You really have to go into the mathematics. So that's the glory of science. Our intuitions, even if you're the author of the theory, your intuitions can be tutored by the theory. And that's why we do science.
So, I mean, of course, Einstein gave space and time, like he bridged them together. But before that, Newton's theory of gravity, which also it kind of helped us to solve or to understand a lot of things at that time. But do you think that we can have equivalent of Newton's theory of gravity, like a kind of a local problem or local answer of consciousness, and then probably which can be like later on for sure transformed into something which is beyond space-time?
Yes, well, the theory of consciousness that I'm working on with my collaborators, Chetan, Prakash Manish Singh, Chris Fields, and Federico Fagin, and Robert Prentner. There's many people that I've worked with and am working with. The theory we're working on already is non-local. It's not confined to space and time. It's a non-local theory. So in our theory, these agents do not exist in space and time. They exist outside of space and time. Space and time is just one interface of innumerable interfaces that conscious agents could use. So space-time is not special in any way. It's perhaps one interface out of countless that agents can use in interacting with each other. So space-time is nothing special, but of course we're agents that use space-time, so we will have to project into that space-time to get the scientific evidence either for or against our theory. Now, but my attitude, as I said, is there's no scientific theory of everything. That includes my own theories. My theories will be overthrown, and the sooner the better. Hopefully in my lifetime, I can see my own theories die. That's what you really want, is to live long enough to see your theories die and see what's beyond. Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Gödel's incompleteness theorem around 1930 or something like that, in 1931. Perhaps one of the deepest, if not the deepest, bit of mathematics or logic ever. It's truly stunning. What Gödel basically showed is that there is no mathematical formal system that you can write down that's sophisticated enough to at least do arithmetic that can crank out all the things that are true. In other words, what you can prove from your theory, from your mathematics, is always going to be less than all the truth, in principle. there will always be truths that are not provable within your theory, no matter what your theory is. That again is job security for us as scientists. We should, be hooting and hollering. It's discouraging in one sense. We'll never get a theory of everything. It means we'll never have a paper and pencil theory that tells us the whole truth. Never. And that is a fundamental, critical fact about our universe and ourselves. Truth transcends theory. Truth transcends proof. So our scientific, which, and by the way, I still want to do science. We learn every time. When we went from earth, air, fire, and water to Newton, we made a big step forward. When we went from Newton to Einstein, another big step forward. And from Einstein to quantum field theory, another big step forward. And now we're going beyond space-time itself. There's this sense that even though we can never know the whole truth, we can wake up to more and more of it in some sense. And science is a way that we can wake up to more aspects, but the exploration is never ending. And maybe if you think about it, who would want it any other way? Wouldn't it be terrible if I said, you know what, with this theory, it's over. There's nothing, you guys can all go home. It's all done. I mean, either way is strange, right? To say there is a final theory, you can just go home, we're all done. Or the opposite, to say there is no final theory, no matter what you write down, it's not the final word. There's always going to be more work to do. Either way doesn't feel, and those are the two options, right? So it looks like the Gödel is saying there is no theory of everything. We will always forever be exploring. And the attitude that I'm taking right now is, what is exploring? What is it that is exploring? Clearly we're exploring, but what are we? We thought that we were, as Francis put it, nothing but a pack of neurons, right? The us that was thinking about all this stuff, that wanted to explore and was having fun exploring, was nothing but a pack of neurons having certain kind of activity. Well, our science tells us, no, that's not it. Space-time itself is not fundamental. Those pack of neurons are not fundamental. So whatever it is that's exploring, whatever it is that's doing science, it's not a pack of neurons. It's nothing physical. And yet, it's not something other than me either. Whatever I mean, so I don't know what I mean by the word me, but whatever it is, whatever that thing is that's doing the exploring, is not a pack of neurons. It's nothing in space and time. I can use the word consciousness, and I use the word consciousness, but only as a pointer to an infinitely complex realm that we now must explore. And the interesting thing from this perspective is, I'm not separate from what I'm exploring. I'm what I'm exploring in some sense, what I'm exploring. And I can't, from that point of view, ever know myself theoretically. I can only know myself by being myself. So I can know myself in like a non-conceptual knowing. It's sort of a non-conceptual knowing by just being myself. But, and if one interpretation of Gödel is that there's infinite wisdom there, and any conceptual theory that I have is a trivial projection of that infinite wisdom. So this is a different way for scientists to be thinking about science, right? Under Newton, you didn't talk about the observer at all. It was supposed to be completely objective. Under Einstein, you start getting something like an observer because you get these frames of reference. So you get these frames of reference. So, and the Lorentz transformation or Poincare invariance is a relationship among all these different frames of reference. So you're starting to smuggle in some notion of an observer, and Einstein talks about measuring light and so forth. arrival of light beams and so forth. Then in quantum theory, now the act of measurement seems to be really critical. Now the observer, is starting to become a real pain. You can't. I mean, we want to ignore the observer. In Einstein, we can just say he's a frame of reference, but now the observer, unless you try to go with like a multiverse kind of thing where you just have the wave function never collapses, then but that has its own problems, the so-called measure problem. How do you get probability to make sense in that case? But now with consciousness being fundamental, under that, what's going on now is I'm not something other than what I'm studying. I am conscious. I am consciousness itself, or a projection of consciousness, or both. And so now the old dictum, know thyself, becomes maybe what science is about. And maybe what science is a tool that consciousness is using for this endless exploration of itself. So spiritual, I should say something about spiritual traditions have been saying, and people who are from spiritual traditions might be saying, look, this is science just catching up with what we've been saying for thousands of years. Space-time isn't fundamental. You are consciousness, and so forth. And yeah, so various spiritual traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, mystical Christianity, Kabbalah, and Judaism, and so forth. There's all sorts of trends like this, and in some sense they've had it right. Space-time isn't fundamental. There's something deeper. But what they haven't had is tools to explore that something deeper. They've had the first-person experience, and they've had language as pointers. So and the careful teachers in these traditions will tell you that their teachings are merely pointers. Don't take the words too seriously. The thing transcends the pointer. And that's another way of saying what I've said about scientific theories. There's no theory of everything. They always, but what you want are theories that tell you their limits, so that this theory is done. Now I need a deeper theory. And that's what the spiritual traditions have lacked. And that's where science and spirituality need to join together and work together. Spiritual traditions have had this insight that space-time is not fundamental. Hats off to them. They've had the idea that consciousness, whatever that might really mean, is fundamental. Hats off to them. But we know also that religions have been plagued with dogmatism for thousands of years. And that's where science comes in. Individual scientists are, of course, just people. And scientists are, as people, are dogmatic as anybody else. But science as a social institution says, make your theory precise enough so I can show you where it stops. And that's how you stop dogmatism. That's where you stop dogmatism in its tracks, by being precise enough so that we know where your ideas, where your pointers stop. And so if we want to really move forward, if this whole spiritual idea is right, and I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying this is the best idea that I'm playing with right now. And in my theory of consciousness, 1.0, this is the way I'm thinking about it. Well, I'll love to see 10.0 and so forth. But under this framework, if what we're really studying is our own consciousness, and that's what the spiritual traditions have been saying for thousands of years, then the new contribution of science is a way to do this without dogmatism, and a way to do this and when you know where your pointers have reached their limit. We've always said the pointers have their limits, but then we always say, but my religion is right and your religion is wrong, because our pointers differ, right? And we even kill each other over it. Well, there's no reason we can let our theories die in our stead. We can have our theories be precise enough so that we can kill the theory and not have to kill the people. And so this is going to be a much better way for us to grow in our self-understanding using the tools of science.
Beautifully put. That's and the other thing that which basically is interesting is the fact that so even if let's say that we say that now all the agents in the universe, they are conscious, all the particles, they are conscious, right? um, then why this complexity? What is happening with the complexity factor? Like why because this is like brain, for example, or the life in general is the most complex things in the universe, right?
Right.
So what do you think? This is an accident happening with the conscious agents, or there is something there with the, like there is a connection between complexity and conscious agents, I would say, particles.
That's a very important question. So it's hard for us not to think inside space and time. It's very hard for us not to think inside space and time. So we think about particles being fundamental, and maybe consciousness is associated with particles, if it's associated at all. I mean, so panpsychism will say that. Most of my colleagues would not even associate consciousness with particles. They would say, of course, it's silly. Particles have position, momentum, spin, charge, but consciousness, forget it. There's no unit of consciousness. That's the standard view. So the consciousness that I'm talking about is nothing inside space-time. Particles, nothing. There's nothing inside space. It's the other way around. Space-time is inside your consciousness completely. And it's just a small part of your consciousness. Space-time is not all of your consciousness. That's just part of your consciousness. And this makes a couple important predictions. One is we make a distinction between animate and inanimate objects, between the living and the non-living. We'll say a person is alive, a rat is alive, an ant is alive, an amoeba is alive, a virus, I don't know, RNA, don't know.
Maybe during the pandemics, it's alive.
Yeah. If it's not alive, it's sort of acting like it. And then we get down to okay, hydrogen and oxygen, no, fundamental particles, they're not alive. From this other perspective, that evolution is teaching us that space and time are just a user interface. They're not the fundamental reality. Every user interface, by definition, is simplifying. Whatever is beyond the interface, I mean, you don't have a window, you have an interface because you're trying to simplify things. You're dumbing them down, right? If you just want to see the truth, you'd have a window. But the user interface is saying, okay, I'm not going to show you this. I'll simplify that. This I'll show you a little bit more about this aspect of things, but I'm not going to show you anything about this. I'm not going to, in the case like your desktop, I'm not going to show you the voltages in your computer. You don't need to know about those voltages. So I'm going to show you nothing about those voltages, nothing about those magnetic fields, nothing. So the distinction that we make between living and non-living is an artifact of our interface. It's nothing deep. It's a trivial consequence of the fact that our interface gives us more insights into what's beyond the interface in certain cases and less in others. When I see your body, I get some insights into your life, your consciousness, and so forth. When I see a cat, less. When I see an ant, even less. And when I see, a rock, my interface is given up. It's a rookie mistake to take my interface at face value and say, aha, because I don't see evidence of life in the rock, therefore, that means there isn't any. No, it just means that my interface gave up. That's all. And our best science can teach us that. That's what evolution by natural selection teaches us. So the consciousness is not in space and time, but the way I'm thinking about it, to get at your complexity question now, consciousness is unbounded in its complexity for the following reason. If consciousness is, I'm working on the assumption consciousness is what there is. Okay, that's reality. Well, if that's all what reality is, then mathematics can only be about the possible varieties of consciousness and the conscious experiences. That's what mathematics is about. There's nothing else to be about. Gödel tells us there's no end to the exploration of mathematical structure. No end. And that means consciousness exploring itself in understanding itself. There's no end to that process. So the complexity is there because of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Truth transcends proof, and truth can be as complicated as you wish, and so proof, the theories are as complicated as you want, and truth just laughs. Not complicated enough. No matter how complicated your theory is, it doesn't even scratch the surface of the complexity of the reality, and that's just the nature of things. So when we then have a particular user interface, so as certain conscious agents are contemplating the totality of consciousness through an interface, we're facing this Gödelian infinite complexity. We're projecting that complexity down into a trivial interface. We were impressed with it. Space and time was really impressive, but now we realize it's just a data structure. And we're not little creatures inside space-time. Space-time is a little structure inside us. It's a complete transformation of perspective. I'm not this little tiny object in space-time. Space-time's been around for 13.8 billion years. I'm this tiny little trivial thing that came along 13.8 billion years later. It's the other way around. Space-time itself and the whole notion of time is a little data structure that I as consciousness am using. And part of that data structure that I'm using has complex things that we call brains. Now that is really interesting because our interface can be viewed as a way of having connections with consciousness. It's consciousness connecting with itself through portals. So from this point of view, you and I are both consciousness. The portal by which consciousness is talking is Hoffman's body to Jitendra's body, and in particular through our brains and so forth. So, but those are just, right, those are not fundamental entities. Those are data structures. Any object is just a data structure in space and time. So your brain is a data structure. To be very explicit, right now, I do not have a brain. There are I have no neurons. Now, if you opened my skull and looked inside, you would see neurons because you were creating them as objects of perception. Neurons and brains are objects of perception. They do not exist when they're not perceived. The moon does not exist when it's not perceived. These things are not there. In physics terms, local realism and non-contextual realism are false. The idea that these things exist and have definite properties that have influences that propagate no faster than the speed of light and that don't depend on the measurement context, that assumption that we all deeply believe, we just know it's true, is provably false. Quantum theory says local realism, non-contextual realism are false. So I just have to go with our best science. Neurons do not exist when they're not perceived. The reason why we can't get a theory of how neural activity creates conscious experience is because neurons aren't even there to create the conscious experience. They don't even exist to create it. They're just a good data structure that we use when we look inside neurons. So what we're really doing is we have a space-time interface, and it has certain portals to consciousness. And the best portals are things that we call human bodies and brains. And I get the most, so that's the clearest portal that I have to consciousness. When I look at my cat, I've got another portal into consciousness, but it's darker. It's not as clear. With an ant, my portal is really poor, and when I get down to viruses, my portal is extremely poor, and a rock, my portal is given up. So the complexity of the brain only exists when I look inside the brain. When I'm looking at my interface, using my interface. When I'm looking through at a portal with my own interface to see how that portal works, I see things like brains. As we understand this, we might be able to get new technologies for opening new portals. I mean, we have one technology for opening new portals into consciousness. It's very low tech. It's called having kids. When we have kids, it takes several years, but we open up a new portal, right? So it's a process that takes quite a bit of time for a portal to be opened up, but we open up a new portal into consciousness. Once we understand how our interface works, if we can get a theory of consciousness beyond the interface, and we can understand mathematically our space-time interface as a data structure, then we may be able to hack that data structure. We may be able to hack and create new portals. Now, this is a very, very different idea than the standard question that is often raised: could AIs be conscious, right? Could we make artificial intelligence systems that are conscious? There, the question is, of course, space and time are fundamental, we assume, and particles are fundamental, but if you get them complicated enough, consciousness could emerge. So could we get silicon circuits and software that are complicated enough with the right kind of complexity, the right function? This is, in philosophers, they call this functionalism. With the right function, will we then somehow create consciousness, or is that identical to consciousness? That's sort of that idea. Well, that is ruled out by our best theories. Those particles don't even exist. The brain doesn't even exist. The physical system that you thought would be the source of this function doesn't even exist, independent of measurement. So it can't possibly do it. So what I'm proposing is something entirely different. We might be able to open up technologies that might look like circuits and software, but that may be what it looks like, but it's not going to be a prior physical silicon circuits and software thing that's creating consciousness. It's rather that consciousness is playing with the data structure. When it plays with that data structure to open up new portals, the data structure it plays with, it creates things that look like, AIs with circuits and software. It's a completely different framework that we're going to have. And I'm going into this in detail because this is so different from the way we think. It's just so different that at every step I have to explain what I'm saying, because it just won't make sense. It'll always be interpreted. Of course, the neurons are doing it. Of course, the particles are doing it. And I'm saying absolutely, I do not have a brain. No one on Earth has a brain. Only when it's looked at are there neurons. Otherwise, there are no neurons. When you grasp how seriously I'm saying that, then you grasp how seriously we have to change our whole conceptual system to understand this.
The only thing is that, let's say when you open the brain, I mean, because it's not about semantics. I hope it's not about semantics, right? Like, because you see stuff, right?
Right.
And I don't know, would there be like in the future any way, like kind of, I don't know, are we expecting some kind of new technology which can just record that stuff, and somehow we can understand that, no, this stuff is real, and now we can start calling it neurons?
Well, so neurons are what we get when we look, right? Those are the symbols we get. Or they could be, gluons, or bosons, or protons. These are all simply data structures that are created in our user interface. And think about it like when you're playing a virtual reality game. You put on a headset. You're racing cars, to say, with people from around the world. And I look over there and I see a red Mustang. Well, when I look over there, I'm creating the red Mustang that I see. There is no red Mustang. I mean, in this metaphor, there's some supercomputer somewhere that's running the game. I just have a headset on. When I see a red Mustang, I create the red Mustang. When I look, there's some complicated megabytes of software that's the reality I'm interacting with. When I interact with that reality, I create this stupid thing that I call a red Mustang, but the reality is far more complicated than my little red Mustang. When I look over there now, I delete the red Mustang. I just throw it away. I don't need it. It's not being, it doesn't, the Mustang does not exist. The supercomputer in this analogy still exists, but the Mustang is gone. Now I'm looking over here at a green Camaro. So now I've created that green Camaro. Now, if I look back, I might recreate the red Mustang. So if you think about it in virtual reality, that will really help. When we look inside inside skulls, we create brains just like we create that red Mustang. And as soon as we look away, we delete that data structure is not needed, and we delete it. So the neurons and brains are merely convenient data structures that we use when we need them, and then we garbage collect them. In computer science terms, we garbage collect that data structure when we don't need it. So that's why I say I have no neurons right now, because they haven't, in my case, I don't think they've ever even been created. That data structure, maybe I've had a brain imaging or something like that, so there was some creation of that data structure, but right now I have no neurons. And in fact, I have no heart. Of course, if you look in the right way, you will create that data structure. I mean, I recently had heart surgery because of COVID. It gave me some serious heart problems that required heart surgery. So I'm glad that there was someone who knows that data structure and can operate on my heart. But the heart doesn't exist when it's not perceived. But once we know those data structures, we then know how to intelligently operate on them in ways that can save lives.
So basically, when you are interacting with the other objects, you just either you create new data structures or you recall the ones which you kind of had stored in the past. So it's still difficult.
Hard.
It's
hard to, but just think of this as a virtual reality. We have a headset on. If you just say, okay, right now I have a headset on, then you'll get the right answers almost all the time as you start to think about this. Yeah, I'm looking over at that. I'm looking at the moon. Okay, I've got a headset on. Okay, that's just like that red Mustang. Okay, I created the moon. And then you might go, well, look, I know that I didn't create the moon because I can ask Joe. Joe over there, do you see the moon? He goes, yeah. Well, of course, think about it in VR. So you got two guys playing the race game again. You say, Joe, is there really a red Mustang over there? And he can say, yeah, there is. Well, that doesn't mean there's really a red Mustang when you know it exists. It just means that Joe's interface does the same thing as your interface. That's all. So we get a million people. We all look at the moon and say, look, a million people can't be wrong. Well, a million people just have the same interface. So we all created the moon at the same time. That's all. That's a data structure that we all created together. So all the normal stuff that we would say, of course, that proves that it's really there. Just play it in. If you just do the game yourself of, okay, could I do the same thing in virtual reality? Oh shoot, yeah, I could do the same thing in virtual reality, and I know it's not there in virtual reality. Okay, that's how you sort of wake up to, okay, this what our best science is telling us is, look, this is a virtual reality. It's not the truth, and we have a headset on. That basically everything I've said, you can sort of get it from that. We're wearing a headset, full stop. That's what we're doing. We're wearing a headset. We're not saying the truth. And even when we introspect, we're introspecting through a headset, as long as we're thinking about things. The only way from this point of view that we might be in touch with something deeper is when we let go of thought altogether and just be with what we are. It's not a conceptual understanding of ourselves, but it's an understanding by being ourselves. And that may be what the spiritual traditions have been saying for a long time, but now we can do this with mathematics, and we can go and get better and better pointers. The conceptual understanding of ourselves can be accelerated using science. And the quote unquote waking up process, waking up to who we are, We're not any particular theory. We're that which creates the theories. We are that which can have a theory. What is it that's so deep that it has this potential for endlessly creating new theories? That's what we are. But there's no theory of it because it's the thing that makes all the theories.
I remember reading Yuval Harari's *Sapiens* because in his book he mentions about imagined reality. That was easy to perceive because he talks about like money and hierarchy and all the different things that we have created. These are it's called imagined reality. It's just that like bunch of us, we can come together, we can like agree on certain things, and we like and this just a paper becomes so valuable for us that we can like kill each other, etc., whatever.
That's right. Right.
um and then I remember also reading Schrodinger's book where he kind of tries to mention, and also his famous experiment, cat experiment.
Right.
And so most of this conversation that we have discussed in like this view, it's basically the expansion of that. I mean, when we are talking about the reality, which is like this observer based understanding, that if the observer is looking, it's real. If it's not looking, it's not real, right?
Exactly.
The so I mean, so one thing is certainly that this is a bad news for biologists. Maybe they can go home because what
Could I say
they
something
can
about
do up
that?
to. I'm sorry.
Could I say something about that?
Yeah, sure.
Um, Actually, I think this is job security for biologists. This is really good news. What I'm saying is that neuroscience, for example, needs a lot more funding because it's a lot more difficult than we thought. We thought, I look in a microscope, I see neurons. That's because there are neurons. Oh, no, no, no. You're seeing a data structure that's a projection of a much deeper dynamical system. That's the deeper dynamical system that biologists and neuroscientists need to understand. So we need more money because we have to reverse engineer the 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 neurons, the synapses, the gap junctions, the networks. We have to reverse engineer that, pull that back into something beyond space and time that projects into space and time, that gives us what we call biology and neurons. So I am not against neuroscience. I think we need more funding for neuroscience because neuroscience um, has a lot, all the hard work is ahead. Once you realize that all of our neuroscience has only been the surface, we've only been seeing neurons as a surface data structure, we've been missing the complexity behind that's projected into that surface structure of neurons. So we need more funding to reverse engineer biology and neuroscience and find the deeper structures and then show mathematically how they project into neural networks in the brain and their activity. So this is actually wonderful news, and especially good news for the new generation of biologists and neuroscientists. A lot of students have the feeling from their classes, geez, it would have been really good to be alive 100 years ago because there was so much that hadn't been learned, so much to explore. But now it's all over. They've done it. All these brilliant people. It's in the textbooks. It's all over. They've done it. And I'm saying, no, 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 no. The most elementary textbooks have yet to be written. It's your job. It's the younger generation. It's your chance. You're the generation that gets to step beyond our interface for the first time in human history in a precise way. The spiritual traditions have proposed this and suggested this and done it through meditation and so forth. Here's a chance to do this rigorously with the tools of science for the first time in human history. So this is the generation that is the golden generation that gets all the big new surprises when we first step out of the headset. What do we find? So this is not bad news for biology. This is wonderful news for all the young biologists. You get to do it. I'm jealous of you guys.
That should certainly motivate people, scientists.
Yes.
But what has been the criticism from other people about your work?
Oh, many, many, many. Um, many of the criticisms are just simply this. This is obviously not worth even talking about. You know, space-time is fundamental. Reductionism has been clearly useful for hundreds of years. This is nonsense. And to them, I just say, check out, if you Google "space-time is doomed," Nima Arkani-Hamed, the physicist. He's got Harvard lectures at Harvard. So if you Nima, Nima, Arkani-Hamed, Arkani-Hamed, he's got lectures starting in, if you do his Harvard lectures, 2019, you can have an entire class of 25, 30 lectures that he gives, and he'll explain why reductionism is dead, physics is moving beyond, and so that's one kind of response that I get, and my response to it is go take Nima's class, and then you'll see why the physicists are not debating space-time. It's over for space-time. There's no debate. It's done. That is gone. And the fact that our work in evolution by natural selection confirms that just suggests that we're on the right track, right? That but here's one technical. What I do welcome are very precise technical objections, right? So we have a theorem that we published about evolution by natural selection, the probability being zero, that there would be any selection pressures to see the truth. If someone wants to not just dismiss it and go, well, if that were the case, our ancestors wouldn't have lived and we wouldn't be here. That's not playing the game properly. But if someone wants to take the mathematics in our theorems and say, we're going to challenge that particular assumption of your theory, then I'm completely on board. Now we're doing real science here. And so there's a group at Yale that we're friends with. Someone on my team was very, very good friends with someone leading the Yale group, and they've done some simulations and have some experiments in which they want to show that when there are 20,000 fitness payoff functions, instead of just one fitness payoff, if you have 20,000 fitness payoff functions, and the certain assumptions that they make, in that case, they find that it's better to see the truth than to try to be tuned to the fitness. So and then now we're playing the game of science in the right way. In our response, and we're writing a paper right now, is the following. If you allow a system, an organism, to take these thousands of fitness payoffs and cluster them, so do what we call hierarchical clustering. So similar payoff functions, you sort of cluster them together, and you create units out of them. Units that we might call objects, for example, or features, colors, and so forth. Then what we show is that the Yale results go away. And once again, once you allow the flexibility to create these data structures where you're taking the fitness payoffs, making objects out of them effectively by clustering, then once again, seeing the truth goes extinct. And that's what objects are. So if objects aren't the truth, right? Space and time is not fundamental. Objects are data structures that we create. Why do we create those data structures? This is why we create them. We create them from an evolutionary point of view. I'm just talking from the point of view of evolutionary theory, not from this deeper theory of consciousness. So I'm just using evolutionary theory right now. From the evolutionary theory point of view, well, we create objects as data structures to represent certain fitness payoffs. Right? So for an apple, to be really concrete, an apple is a data structure, and it tells me for certain actions like eating, this will be very, very useful. For other actions like mating, not at all. For fighting, maybe you could throw an apple at somebody, but it's not going to do much damage. You might want to pick up a rock if you're going to try to do something like that. So for every object, so every time I change objects, I'm changing the fitness payoffs. Here's my laptop, okay? There's a set of fitness payoffs. Here's my fork, a new set of fitness payoffs. Here's um, my stove. So every object, so yeah, we deal with thousands and thousands of fitness payoffs. And how do we do that? Well, as if we're allowed to organize them into objects, then once again we have these useful fictions and we don't see the truth. And so that's, I would say that that one is the perhaps the single deepest technical objection that we've had. And we've gotten it from a couple groups where they say, well, what if you have lots of fitness payoffs and they're changing very, very quickly? That's a legitimate technical kind of objection, but it's easily met.
And I think it's also, it'll be a bit, how to say it, like it'll be a bit stupid to believe that evolution kind of, produce the solutions that we see. I mean, evolution doesn't. It is a random process which just takes the template which is there, and that template. I mean, it does make sense that that template is used to produce more kind of fitter species rather than a species who are looking for absolute truth or reality. So,
Right. The name of the game is having kids, not seeing truth from an
exactly.
evolutionary point of view.
Yeah, the best example is that how many things that we can't see. I mean, in general, that our senses are limited. I mean, you can't imagine life in 2D. You can't imagine seeing in UV. you
Right.
know. So these things, they do show that we are limited in reality, but how much we are limited, that's now your work.
Uh, that's right. And the standard attitude has been, as you say, that we don't see all of reality. Of course, we don't see all of reality. But then the assumption has been, but of course, we see parts of reality, and the parts that we needed to stay alive. And that logic seems so compelling, and it's just deeply wrong. We didn't need to see any aspect of reality to stay alive. The 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 only little technical thing here, I'll just mention it for the mathematicians. Evolutionary theory, as I said, puts no constraint on the payoff functions. So that's why we said you have to look at all possible payoff functions. And then when you do that, the ones that preserve the truth have probability 0 because there's so many of these payoff functions. There's only one exception. Evolutionary theory is a scientific theory. Every scientific theory has to assume that whatever reality is, the probability of events in that reality are not arbitrarily related to the probability that we see of events in our measurements, in our perceptions. If the probabilities of perceptions were just arbitrarily related to probabilities of events in objective reality, then science itself would not be possible. And so evolutionary theory does, because it's a scientific theory, it has that assumption. So there's one structure then that evolutionary theory does require, and it's by the very fact that it's a scientific theory, it requires something called sigma algebras, or sigma additive classes more generally. These are also called measurable structures, but sigma algebras, sigma additive classes, are that's the one structure that has to be preserved in the sense of being a homomorphism. It could be that it's an infinite to one mapping, so that the reality could be have all these measurable structures, these sigma algebras, and it's a mapping that's infinite to one, but it still has to be a homomorphism. So that's the only exception to the general rule that I said. It's a technical. If people don't understand it, don't worry. But the bottom line is, yeah, the probability is 0 that we don't see reality, that we see reality. Probability 0 that anything we see is objective reality according to evolution by natural selection.
Yeah, let's take the last question, which should be about the fact, are we limited in kind of also studying the reality, or in the future with new science we'll be able to kind of do the experiments to measure the reality, which is something like, or will have the same, this observer problem in the future as well, even if we have the new science or new maths. um,
I suspect that as we develop new theories, we will discover new technologies that will be completely mind-blowing, that will open up all sorts of new possibilities. I see that this is probably a never-ending process. If you think about it, in the 1800s, Michael Faraday was doing all these wonderful experiments on electricity and magnetism, and brilliant, brilliant experiments. And he wrote down very, very careful experiments and data. And then Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, I think around 1887 or something like that, was brilliant and was able to summarize all of Faraday's experiments in a few equations that we call Maxwell's equations. And now I'm using a beautiful mathematics called geometric algebra and the notion of multivectors. We can take and write down Maxwell's equation as a single equation. So it's the Maxwell equation. If you do it right, you don't use complex numbers, you use multivectors. Complex numbers are a poor substitute for multivectors. Then you can write down the Maxwell equation. Now, that equation is in Maxwell's early forms and now the current, this is the foundation of all. I mean, I'm talking with you right now, across thousands of miles. And that would be inconceivable to a Newtonian in 1840. Just inconceivable. There's nothing in their approach that would make this an obvious technology, put it that way. With Maxwell's equations, all of a sudden we realize, whoa, it's just mathematics. Think about it. It's just mathematics. But the mathematics is saying, hey, if you do this with this kind of things, magnets and electrons and so forth, eventually we call them electrons, you could eventually create a Zoom system where someone could talk to someone else on the other side of the world, and there would be almost no noticeable lag, and you could actually see their expression in real time, and that's inconceivable. But just one Maxwell equation, we can write it down as a thing with multivectors. One Maxwell equation opens up that world. Of course, quantum mechanics and so forth built on that. So my guess is that as we get these structures beyond space-time, technologies are going to open up that right now would just be jaw-dropping. So, for example, right now, most of the galaxies that we can see are moving away from us so fast that even if we traveled at the speed of light, we couldn't reach them. There's all that real estate out there just smiling at us and waving at us, and it's waving goodbye. We could never get there, most of it. It's a really strange thing that all that we can see the real estate, and we know in principle we could never get to it going through space-time. But what if space-time, seen as just a data structure, allows us not simply to go through it, but around it? What if we can, once we have the bigger framework and we understand that bigger framework, and space-time is just a little data structure inside this bigger framework, we may end up with tools that allow us to go to Proxima Centauri instead of taking 4.5 years, or Andromeda Galaxy 2.4 million years to get there. I just go there now, just like I'm talking to you now. In fact, if we can go outside space-time. So I think that once we let go of the mental shackles of physicalism and reductionism, they've been useful tools, but now they're just mental shackles. Once we let go of them, and then my generation won't, we just have to die, but the next generation will. They will let go of the shackles, and they will discover technologies that will be effectively indistinguishable from magic from our current point of view.
Yeah, how exciting it is. And I mean, so far you've been saying it, now it's my time. I can say that this is the most exciting times for the scientists, for us to exist and do science, discuss science, and how broad these ideas are. It's just fascinating. And with that, Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Basically, sharing the case against reality with the humanity. So I think we can kind of start thinking outside our box, which is in between our 2 years, and
Yes,
let's hope that it will transform the thinking of science and humanity. Thank you.
absolutely. I look forward to reading what the next generation discovers. I can't wait.
Yeah,
Thank you, Jitendra.
thank you.